One of our great challenges is in dealing with suffering, and I'd like to take a look at that again from a Buddhist and also from a perspective of Christian faith. Uh, a lot of times when someone speaks who is a spiritual leader, it's not so much the words that the person says, it is the spirit behind the words. So as we examine this wisdom from the Buddhist and the Christian traditions, it's good to ask ourselves, well, what is the spirit that is behind these words? We think, for example, of people that are fleeing from violence. And we see so much of it in our world today. We see war and violence. We see violence in our own communities. We see the violence of gun violence, where we have assault rifle weapons that can kill many people rapidly and really create havoc in people's lives, unfortunately. We see this, we're appalled by it, and we see the violence of war, we see bombs being dropped, and we, of course, ask ourselves, what is happening here? And we turn to our spiritual traditions for guidance. And a lot of times when we do that, the wisdom that comes, the answer that comes, the response that comes, is that God is crying, because this is not how God wants us to live. And we look at our various religious traditions, and particularly some of those traditions are being blamed for causing violence. We look at incidences like the Crusades, and we look at the different holy wars, and we say, well, persecutions, people burned at the stake, look at people who were tortured about religious questions. We say to ourselves, well, wait a minute, is this what God wants? As we look at the wisdom of the different religious traditions, we say, no, this is not really what God is about. God is about peace. God is about harmony. God is about bringing people together. God is not about hatred. God even tells us, love your enemies. Do good to those who harm you. So it's a different tradition. It's a tradition of God being sensitive to our needs, God wanting to create a world that is not a world of violence, but a world of love. So when we reflect on that question about God and suffering, many writers will say, well, God is crying because this is not what God wants. This is not what God is about. So we kind of anthropomorphize God, we make God into a human being and say God is crying. But what it's really telling us is that this is not the path that God encourages us to travel upon. People, though, in many situations where there is violence, people come to help out. People come to assist. People bind up the wounds of those who have been shot. People help. People are compassionate. Even when someone is dead by violent means, just that care, that concern, that reaching out, that hug, that simple phone call can mean so much. People want to bring healing. People want to counter that violence. When that happens, we say then that God begins to smile. God smiles because this is the path that God wants us to travel upon. This is what God is all about. God wants to bring people together in love, in harmony, in peace, in understanding, and compassion. So as we look at our Buddhist path, we look at our Christian path, we see this agreement. But this is not what God wants. This is not what God is about. Suffering, however, does have a role to play in our lives. And this is the consistent teaching of our religious traditions, both in Buddhism and in Christianity. You might say, well, what is the role of suffering? Suffering helps us to develop compassion. When we see other people suffering, we say, this is not what God wants. This is not what we want. We have to help out. We have to alleviate the suffering. We have to do something to make this world better, to lessen the suffering. And so when we do that, we develop a sensitivity. We develop a compassion. Sometimes a simple remark that we make might cause suffering. Sometimes we don't even intend the suffering. We just make a silly remark, an unfortunate remark. We say something that we later regret. We say, that was dumb of me to say that. Why did I say that? That was stupid. And so we develop, through that suffering, we develop compassion. And we think, well, I would not want someone to say that to me. So we become more compassionate in terms of our remarks, in terms of what we share with others. So we think of suffering as a negative, and of course it is, something to be avoided. We don't want to, in a masochistic way, take suffering on when we don't have to, obviously. But it also has a positive role to play in terms of us becoming more compassionate and more sensitive. Nelson Mandela, for example, the great leader from South Africa, reflected on his 27 years in prison. He said those 27 years, each and every one of them, was necessary for me to become a more magnanimous person. That suffering helped me. It helped me to become a better person. Because I went through that suffering, after I was liberated, I became a better leader, a better person, a more understanding leader. And so that suffering actually helped Nelson Mandela, and he admitted that. He shared that. Patrick Wadhwa, who has done prenatal research, has an interesting observation about that. He says stress and opposition initiate our development in utero. That in order to develop as people, we need stress, we need opposition. Sometimes we don't think of that, right? Our stem cells do not differentiate and become us if there is not biological stress to encourage them to do so. So literally, we wouldn't develop to become the persons we are today unless there was stress, suffering, opposition in our lives.